What's up, everybody? This is Mike Manzer with another Manzerfaust Productions video. Today, I am back, and I'm here to dive into a new series I want to start about different regions and the music that comes out of them. You know, I want to get into some international stuff eventually, but I'm starting here in the United States, my home country, and I'm gonna get into a city that's pretty nearby, about 2 hours from me on the train, and that's New York. And I want to get into some NYHC. So starting off with hardcore, a genre I'm very familiar with, been listening to it most of my life. Been going to hardcore shows, seen a lot of these bands live multiple times. And it's like a big part of my DNA is New York hardcore, along with Boston and Connecticut stuff and a lot of DC stuff, some stuff coming out of California, all the different places. But it seems like New York, especially over the last few years, has really taken over my record collection more than any other region. So I'm going to jump into it. So I'm going to go into kind of chronological best I can, but I'm going to break it up by different sounds. So I'm going to get into like the early kind of skinhead stuff, and then go into crossover, talk about some of the straight edge hardcore stuff coming off of Revelation Records in the late 80s, and then I'm going to kind of end it where the documentary NYHC came out, probably around 95, 96, and I'm going to talk about a couple of the bands that are covered in that, and kind of do a brief overview of the timeline. A lot of you might already be familiar with a lot of this music. You might know more. This is just the bulk of what's important to me, and what I have in my collection. And I'll mention some other albums as we go along, just out of context, that I don't have in my collection, and you should go check those out as well. So without further ado, I guess for me, one of the most important bands to really start this conversation with is Agnostic Front. They weren't the first New York hardcore band. I guess you could fit them into that kind of tag early on. I mean, I don't know if it was called New York hardcore at that time, but they were one of the first really big national bands, really took off, became a big name for New York, and really helped establish New York as a hotbed of hardcore punk when, everybody was really looking at Boston and DC on the East Coast for a lot of this stuff. But once Agnostic Front came around, they inspired so many great bands in the wake of their success. So it just makes sense for me to start off with them, and I wanted to start with their probably most their original most important record. I don't know, but it's Victim in Pain. I believe this came out in 82, 83. I'm not really sure. This is a repress for Bridge 9 around 2009. It is on red vinyl. And this is really them coming into their own as a band. They had demos prior to this. Comes in this nice little over case with a nice gatefold. This is them really going into their thrashy, quick, bang them out real quick, get the hell out of there, and raw production, great lyrics, sing along, and very anthemic, but very fast and very aggressive, as was the time. This is around the same time that Minor Threat was still blowing up, and you still had stuff like SSD Control coming out of Boston, and DYS, and bands like Suicidal Tendencies were just coming out, and that album really did cement New York hardcore the way it needed to be. And, you know, if you want to get into some earlier stuff, they had a 7-inch called United Blood that kind of has a similar feel to this, just a lot more raw, a lot shorter songs, a little bit more primitive. And Radio Raheem, which does a lot of like that first wave of New York hardcore kind of stuff on these amazing reissues, put out this No One Rules. I can't remember when this first came out, but I believe this is a newer reissue of it from 2021, I believe. And Radio Raheem does really cool. They throw in a bunch of really great like booklets filled with flyers and a whole bunch of interviews and all that kind of stuff. And we get that on a nice blue vinyl. And yeah, this is a lot more like demo versions of the songs. I believe these are at Don Fury Studios. Let me see. Yeah, Don Fury in 1983 and 1984. So I believe Victim in Pain is probably 84 then. And they're a lot like rougher, more primitive versions, but you can really see what they would be able to pull off with Victim in Pain just a short time later. So definitely check that out if you find it, because it does have a very cool demo vibe to it if you're into that kind of thing. So as they're blowing up, there's a bunch of other bands, younger bands, that start popping up. You know, one of the best ones is probably Urban Waste. Had a really great 7-inch, self-titled. You had there was just a ton of these like younger bands, and they'd be put out by small labels. And one of the ones that stands out, even though they kind of have a weird place within it all, this record can be kind of controversial due to some of the lyrics. It hasn't aged great, and also the band is kind of a weird band to talk about with their different lineups and the feud between the two different versions of the band. But I feel like it's important to talk about, and that's Antidote, Thou Shalt Not Kill, 7-inch EP. This is a repress from 2009, put out by Bridge 9. Got this on a nice green clear vinyl. So this is, again, short blasts of fury, much like the early Agnostic Front stuff. Very crazy vocals. I feel like this is around the time that stuff like Reagan Youth was starting to come out, and people were hearing a lot more like over-the-top vocals and everything like that. So you can really hear a lot of it on this. The Mob is another great early band of that era. And The Accused, Loud and Clear. And this is another Radio Raheem giant, repress. You got the nice gatefold here with a bunch of information. The record's on black, so, I won't bother showing you that. Got the nice giant booklet with a bunch of flyers, much like the Agnostic Front one. And, yeah, I really like Abused. It's more just standard early New York hardcore, early 80s stuff. Very raw, very primitive, very aggressive. Lots of fury, short songs, blasts, get in, get out kind of vibes. But you can hear, like, slight improvements on stuff happening, as time goes on. And later on, in I believe it was 86, you have Cause for Alarm by Agnostic Front, which pushed more of, like, a crossover, what would become known as crossover, like a thrash metal kind of influence in there. They were probably listening to Anthrax and Metallica and Slayer, which were all very big names at the time, really pushing metal. And, like, these forms of punk rock people might not have heard about in those scenes. L'Amour was a big club in the 80s. A lot of these bands would play there, the bigger bands. Cause for Alarm also had lyrics written by Pete Steele of Carnivore and later on Typo Negative, which are, controversial. It's Pete Steele. You kind of get, it comes with the territory, but they really pushed Agnostic Front more into the limelight, sometimes in a bad way. A lot of people found them reactionary and very almost fascist at times. I remember going back and reading old Maximum Rock and Roll articles on them, calling them like Nazi skinheads and everything like that. And it follows along, on the Antidote record, there's a song called Nazi Youth, which is all about how these skinheads are being profiled as Nazis and everything like that. So it was a very and Skinhead, had come over from Europe. A couple of members of the New York hardcore scene had been in Europe and traveled a lot and met people over there who had these skinhead gangs, and they come back and they get all their friends into it and stuff. So one of the bands that really pushed that, and also the crossover sound, probably to its limit. A little bit of a pun there I just picked up on, but and probably one of the most important New York hardcore records of all time is, of course, Age of Quarrel by the Cro-Mags. Amazing, stacked record. Some of the best songs. It's before a lot of this stuff became a little bit full of itself. You could go on about certain members of this band, but the thing is, on this record, everybody's at their A game. You hear a lot of that early 80s Bad Brains influence when they started playing at CBGB's all the time, and when they were really putting on these amazing shows that got all these guys into playing this music so much more. And it taught them a real discipline of playing. You can hear it that Bad Brains were tight, man. They were almost like a jazz fusion band playing hardcore, and they'd have all these reggae parts. It would open people up to these expansive forms of music, and very it's amazing how pivotal Bad Brains is in with all of this, and that blow up of them in the early 80s, playing at CBGB's and other parts of New York, was just, not enough can be said about how influential and groundbreaking that band was. And you had a lot of bands coming out that had that kind of vibe. You had Crumbsuckers, you had a lot of the early stuff from the Nihilistics and all these other bands. And all these bands are playing with a crossover kind of thrashy sound. You had Stormtroopers of Death doing a more straight up thrash, proto-grindcore kind of sound. And those guys were all from Anthrax and Nuclear Assault with Danny Lilker. All these bands were coming out, and they were doing the metal meets punk thing, but pushing it further. You also had, coming out of Texas, you had DRI had been doing it since 1981, and around 87, Crossover came out, and that actually put a genre label on it. And I feel like a lot of these bands are probably digging on some DRI very early on. You can hear a lot of it, especially in those early thrashier, more raw and primitive records like Victim in Pain and the early Antidote stuff. You can hear some of that DRI, just lightning fast, crazy, crazy kind of music. And then as things go on, you still have a strong skinhead element to it. A lot of the guys that have been involved with Cro-Mags and all the surrounding kind of people would go off and make their own bands and mix with people that would be at Lemoore or CBGB's or any of the other clubs. And you had some interesting little mixtures of seeds happening. You had a lot of bands that would be like half metal guys, and they'd have some like punk rock singer or metal guy singer and some backing band of all punks and stuff. And to me, one of the most important records of this era, and also just lyrically, everything about this record really pushed it. And this is a band that would continue to push New York hardcore, any hardcore in general, you know, throughout the 90s and, you know, the early 2000s, and then they broke up and they came back, and they've been going strong ever since they came back in the, I believe, 2010. And that is Sheer Terror, Just Can't Hate Enough. This is Repress. It was what was put out by Blackout. I'm going to mention that label a few more times. They were pretty big in the early days of the crossover scene, through bands like Breakdown, and I believe they put out Brightside by Killing Time. I'm not sure. But, yeah, records on Black, not going to bother with that. But Sheer Terror, this is their first LP. Has a lot of their classic songs, Here to Stay, Cup of Joe, Ashes to Ashes, Just Can't Hate Enough, Walls, Roses, Owe You Nothing. It's just stacked with, like, anthems. And what's cool about Sheer Terror is their singer, Paul Bearer. He just has this way with lyrics and crooning vocals that was really influential on stuff that came out later, not only like Blood for Blood and Biohazard and all these like more metallic tinged bands, but also, you know, a lot of that kind of crazy like Life of Agony and Vision of Disorder, 108, all these bands that had a very hard melodic kind of aspect to the music, and I don't think that would be very prominent without the influence of Sheer Terror, because Paul Bearer would sing these heartbreaking kind of croons, especially on songs like Roses and Walls, where he goes, and even Cup of Joe, where he goes into these like intense, traumatic kind of broken-hearted love stories and these downtrodden like street anthems and all this type of stuff. And it wasn't always about being tough and, you know, being with your friends and positivity and all that kind of shit. He really dove into the human soul, and a broken one at that, and it's utterly beautiful. And the riffs on this are amazing. The band backing him up do not miss at all. It's got a very, the structure of a lot of these songs and the way the riffs are played is very reminiscent of Celtic Frost, which makes sense because some of the members met at a Celtic Frost show. They talk about this in the documentary, which if you get the chance, check out the documentary Beaten by the Fists of God, which is interviews and everything done around the final show they played in 2006 at CBGB's, I believe when it was probably closing up. And yeah, it's just an amazing band with a great amount of like backstory, and like I said, they're still going strong today, releasing interesting music. The album Standing Up for Falling Down from 2014 I thought was amazing. It really cemented even further how great of a lyricist Paul Bearer is in that band, and how much of a unique voice within hardcore and punk rock in general he really has. And it's an amazing record. So when that came out, you also had, you know, the more traditional side of things, and this would grow into many different kind of subsets and everything. You had a little bit of straight edge working in there, what would later become known as Youth Crew. And this had a lot more of like the sing-alongs, and it was all about the sing-alongs. Even like lyrics weren't even really that important, but you know, it's about getting that crowd going. It's all about pride and you know, sticking by your friends and fighting the system and all that great stuff. And I think one of the most important bands to come out of that era was Warzone. fronted by Rabies, R.I.P. And Warzone had, like, that old school, aggression of Agnostic front, a little bit less of the later era metal vibes. There is some metal vibes on the first couple of records, but I feel like it's less of a crossover thing, and it's more just like hardcore has these like kind of riffing parts and stuff. It has a much more traditional kind of vibe to it. And what better to go with than Don't Forget the Struggle, Don't Forget the Streets. This is probably their like definitive album. Again, nothing but, classics. This is a 2016 reissue. But, you got It's Your Choice, Crazy But Not Insane, As One, We're the Crew, the title track, In the Mirror, Skinhead Youth. You have a lot of these, like, same subject matter that have been coming up. And you also have a stronger melody with this band that you hadn't heard as much, but it's a different sort of melody than what I was talking about with Sheer Terror. You got this nice clear red vinyl. It's different than Sheer Terror because again, it's that, typical, like, skinheads and friends and going to shows and fighting kind of stuff. It does get into a lot of, like, really cool kind of vibes. You got a song like Judgment Day, which is all about, the people that push you around all the time, and they talking shit and everything like that. Well, one day it's going to come back to them, and that'll be their Judgment Day. You also have In the Mirror, which is very personal kind of song about, like, growing up and changing and all this kind of stuff, and the person that you see in the mirror might have been different than what you expected your life to turn out to be, and how do you accept that? How do you come to terms with that? So Warzone was a huge band, and you also had some smaller tier bands, and I wanted to bring this up because this is a record I don't think gets a lot of attention these days, and it's a little lesser known. This goes into more what would later be called Youth Crew, which I'm going to get into pretty soon. But I feel like this still has a little bit more of a step in the Cro-Mags era of crossover kind of stuff. There's a lot of great metal riffs. Melody's not quite there, but you got a lot of really cool stuff happening on this. And this is Uppercut, Four Walls from '89, so this is a little later. I'm going a little out of order. But this is on Blackout Records as well, and this is just a great unsung hero of early New York hardcore in the late 80s. You got a lot of great, like, anthemic sounding songs like Salvation and Four Walls, and they just had, like, a different vibe to it. They'd had a lot more of, like, it just, like, had an old school early 80s vibe, like before all the stuff with crossover started happening, and the Sheer Terror type of stuff. It just has a lot more of a solidified early New York hardcore vibe, despite it coming out much later. So with that, you have bands like that happening, and then out of DC and Boston, as mentioned before, you had bands like SSD Control, DYS, obviously Minor Threat coming out of DC and all that, those early Discord bands. And straight edge started happening. And there's a ton of straight edge bands early on, or bands that would talk about straight edge. But none of them really pushed it to becoming like a thing within New York hardcore, and almost like definitive of late 80s New York hardcore, until you get to Youth of Today with Can't Close My Eyes. This is a German early press on We Bite Records, I believe from '86. And this is a, like, aggressive, raw, very primitive, but simple. Like, a lot of these songs just go whizzing by. There's not a lot of like complexity to them, but the lyrics are great, all about positivity and straight edge and the influence you have on those around you and keeping honest about what your goals are, all that kind of stuff. And this really blew open the door for a lot of this stuff happening. And a lot of these bands early on were coming out of Connecticut. Revelation Records is a big name early on. That was based, I believe they were based in New Haven, and they would just start off as a small little like record shop. Ray Cappo, the singer of Youth of Today, had played drums in Violent Children, one of the best like early like Connecticut hardcore bands, very influential in, I'd like to say, like, you know, early skate punk kind of stuff. So yeah, and then so Revelation Records was coming out with a lot of that kind of stuff, and which brings in albums like Speak Out by Bold. This is an OG copy. I'm not really the biggest fan of this album, mostly because the production on it's very wonky. It's very, like, just not of its time. It seems like it was rushed in the studio. The bass doesn't sound good at all. It's just a very amateurish sounding recording, especially for how late in the 80s and all the stuff that came out before that. The power of those early records doesn't really come out on that record per se, but Bold used to be another band called Crippled Youth, and they had like a little bit more of like a playful version of straight edge, a little bit goofy. You hear the vocals, and it's like obviously like a young kid doing the vocals, but it's just, once Bold came out, and not so much on Speak Out, like I said, but more on their second record, Looking Back. I believe it was a 7-inch, but I'm not sure. You had songs like Running Like Thieves, the re-recording of Always Try, and they just went in a more like emotional kind of direction, almost like a lot of the stuff coming out of DC at the time from Embrace and Dag Nasty, Rites of Spring, and so that they were pushing that kind of more melodic element to it. But as you know, with straight edge, it doesn't stay innocent for too long. You know, SSD Control was a pretty brutal band in their day and age in 1982 when they were popping off. It was not friendly straight edge. So you have a lot of that going on, and you got this more militant and more like aggressive, like anti-drug stance that a lot of bands started taking. And of course, out of that came probably one of the most powerful New York hardcore bands of this Youth Crew era, and they even had a little bit more of a metallic sound happening, and that is, of course, Judge with the Bringin' It Down LP. And this is probably, without, like, you know, being ridiculous about it, this is probably, like, my favorite of that Youth Crew era. I'm not the biggest Judge guy in general, but this album and the Lower East, not Lower East Side Crew, the New York Crew, I can't remember. I have a copy of it on 7-inch, but I can't remember the full title of it. But their early stuff is just incredibly aggressive, and the lyrics are like negative straight edge as fuck. I mean, it's pretty intense. Mike Judge has such a like aggressive delivery with these lyrics that it just smacks you in the head. It has an extremely just metallic kind of sound. It's still got that Youth Crew pile on, sing along kind of stuff, but it's just it's looking forward to like stuff down the line that you would get, you know. So I'm gonna end this part of it with another Blackout release. that I think gets a lot of attention, mostly because this album cover's been ripped off 40,000 times. And this is another younger band. I don't think they were straight edge, but they have that kind of youth crew aggression and fury to it. And that's Outburst, Miles to Go. And as you can see, that is the most ripped off album cover of all time. This is an OG press. Spent a lot on it. Thank you once again, Jay from Static Era, for hooking this up. This is one of the best, like, late 80s New York hardcore records. It's a classic. Not much really to say about that. You know, it's got that aggression. It's got that fury. I keep saying it. Then you go a little bit further. This is 89. You get more of that aggressive kind of stuff. You have stuff like Killing Time, the Brightside record. I think I mentioned that earlier. Marauder with Master Killer was a really big release. Even like earlier bands like Rested Pieces and all that kind of stuff. One of my favorites out of all that is Leeway, Born to Expire. This is their second record. I can't remember who put it out originally, but this is solid. This is probably one of the most, like, you know, catchy of the, you know, crossover records. That has a lot really in touch with, like, spreading the disease era Anthrax and the way that the riffs are played and even some of the vocals and stuff. And Leeway, Eddie has, like, an extremely recognizable vocal, just incredibly emotive, but at the same time extremely aggressive, and he went on to influence so many bands after that, you know, especially to talk about a newer band, Mind Force, and they're huge right now, and it's great to see a band really flying that flag of classic New York hardcore and crossover stuff from the late 80s, and they keep getting better and better with every release. But what got me into them originally was hearing that heavy Leeway influence, especially in Jay Preda's voice. So, yeah, and it's just great. So, like, we're moving into the 90s now, and, you know, some time is going by. You have bands like Biohazard, Marauders still going pretty hard. Life of Agony comes out with River Runs Red, probably one of the most important early 90s hardcore records across the board. You have stuff coming out of New Jersey that was really big, like Floor Punch, Bouncing Souls, a lot of that kind of stuff, different varieties of shit happening. So later on, you have this emergence of, like, even heavier bands. They took that crossover metal kind of sound of Leeway and Killing Time, Breakdown, and pushed it even further. And you had stuff like Beatdown coming out, like Bulldoze. You had a lot of that stuff coming out of the Biohazard scene, which Biohazard had a very more towards the metal crowd as time went on. You know, stuff like State of the Union Address and stuff like that. You would hear a lot more metal people getting into those records, and they had a lot of the Sepultura kind of, maybe even some early Entombed kind of vibes to some of that later stuff, and they also had a lot of hip-hop elements to it. And so this led up to, in the mid-90s, you had a movie come out called New York Hardcore, directed by Frank Pavish, I believe his name is. He went on later on to do the amazing documentary on Alejandro Jodorowsky's version of Dune that was supposed to come out in the 70s, never ended up happening. Amazing documentary, but this is a more lo-fi, just guys on the streets. He's shot a lot of it at Coney Island High and CBGB's and all these other clubs. It gets into the pit and everything like that. It features a ton of great bands. 25 to Life, Vision of Disorder, No Redeeming Social Value, 108, District 9, which is another very underrated, extremely, like, progressive kind of, like, crossover hardcore, a little bit of beatdown in there as well. It was mostly black and Puerto Rican kids making up the group, which is very cool, had a different vibe. Like I said, there's some like hip-hop influence coming into it, and so I want to end this by talking about two groups that really stand out, and again, go to this day and still have their own extreme influence within all of this. And I feel like you can't talk about New York hardcore without talking about Madball. Set It Off from 1994. And this is again, anthems. Madball was a little side project of members of Agnostic Front with Roger, who was this longtime singer of Agnostic Front's half-brother on vocals, who would be known as Freddie Madball, and he would go, the story goes, early on, he would take Freddie to shows, and he'd see all this incredible stuff, and he even got up on stage with Agnostic Front and sang It's My Life. It's like a cover of an Animals song, and just from there it just blew up. And I believe like their earlier 7-inch Ball of Destruction had like Vinny Stigma and some of the members that were doing Agnostic Front at that time. And Set It Off, again, nice little red vinyl. Set It Off was really just like the crowning achievement of their early stuff, because it had a lot of hip-hop groove to it. The drumming was very much in that realm, but you know, you also had a lot of gang kind of lyrics, and the streets. It was all about the streets, you know. It was like people stabbing you in your back, and you know, the violence that you see every day, how it kind of breaks down your mentality after a while, all that kind of stuff. And it's like intense seeing those early shows and early lineups of that band just going haywire, and the music is just so intense and so direct and doesn't fuck around for a minute. And I feel like they are like the chief band out of all of that mid-90s New York hardcore that was going more in like a gang direction. You had, again, the influence coming off of stuff like Bulldoze, of the more like beatdowns and stuff written for the pit to make it just as like aggressive as possible. Also 25 to Life had a little bit more of a metal vibe to it, and a little bit more of a hip-hop vibe to it, and they were a pretty big name at the time. And so, like, another band that was really big of that era, who was a big part of that documentary, is, of course, Crown of Thorns. This is Train Yard Blues. I believe it's their first, first album. It's on a single-sided LP. Crown of Thorns had that metal, hip-hop, everything like that. A little bit more of a sense of humor, though. They kind of follow in the footsteps of bands from the 80s, like Murphy's Law and Rested Pieces and even Killing Time, where it's intense street knowledge kind of stuff, but you also have a little bit of a sense of humor about it, and that comes a lot from Lord Ezak, the singer. He went on to do Danny Diablo and Ice Pick. Just an extremely charismatic, hilarious dude coming out of New York, and just some of the stuff he says in the documentary are just the most quotable stuff in the whole documentary. It's just an icon. And I love Crown of Thorns for the graffiti aspect of it. I feel like a lot of bands were into graffiti, and a lot of that, you had Abolition, Burn, which is a band I'm surprised I didn't mention earlier. You had a lot of that early 90s still in that melodic, metallic hardcore range. But, you know, they never just specifically wrote songs about that lifestyle, you know, going around graffiti and different wars going on, bomber wars and everything like that. You know, it's very cool to hear, and it's got a lot of nice, like, little sound bites about skinheads at shows, little news articles about graffiti, how it's changing society in New York at the time, and all this kind of stuff. It really puts you, that and Set It Off by Madball, those are two records that really put you in that time and place of mid-90s New York before Giuliani took over and pretty much sanitized the whole fucking thing. And it's still an intense place. It's still bombed out, you know, still places you can't really go. You know, the Avenue A scene was still, like, insane. You didn't go there unless you had a reason to. And, you know, you'd get fucked with probably. You know, it's just... And that's where I want to end it, because that's kind of that era of New York hardcore. And, you know, there's a ton of other bands. You know, you got Gorilla Biscuits, a ton of, you know, other stuff I could have mentioned. And it's just such a healthy scene of so many different influences, so many different bands. They branch off and do other things. Shelter came out of Youth of Today, and that was a very influential band in the Krishnacore scene, which also has What a Weight as a part of it, and just all these extremely important influences came out of it. You know, a lot of the late 90s kind of more emotional stuff, like Kid Dynamite and Lifetime. You can really hear some Gorilla Biscuits, even some Crown of Thorns in there and stuff like that. I hear a lot of that cool stuff, and it's just amazing that it all came out of this, like, 10, 15-year period out of New York, and just so much changed about it. And, you know, crossover's such a big thing. You know, nowadays it's no big deal to have bands that have a metallic kind of punk rock vibe to it, and they're still very firmly based in hardcore. But at the time, you know, that was like taboo. You know, you had a lot of fights between metalheads and skinheads and, you know, punk rockers and everything like that. Nobody really got along. It was like warfare a lot. And so to have this music that came from everybody kind of coming together, different beliefs, you know, you have the Krishna thing, you have a lot of even like some Christian, like, kind of stuff coming into the scene, and you got straight edge, you got the more like skinhead, like drunk guys happening, you got all this kind of shit happening, and it all comes together in this wonderful scene that, you know, pumped out so many amazing records, so many influential, like, amazing records that really changed the course of extreme music, heavy music for the rest of time. So yeah, you know, that's New York hardcore for you in a little nutshell. You got a lot of modern bands, like I mentioned, Mind Force. You got Pain of Truth coming out of Long Island. You got Age of Apocalypse, who has a very Life of Agony influenced sound with a little bit of Leeway, and it's just, you still hear it very much in these bands. And, you know, a lot of, like, the classics are still going. You know, Eddie Leeway, Never Stop, Sick of It All, Madball still going pretty hard. Even Agnostic Front plays all the time. Sheer Terror. all these bands are still flag the flag for what made New York hardcore so great and what made it such a force to be reckoned with over the years. And I love it. You know, it's one of my favorite genres, regional genres of music. It's very important to me in my life, and so much of this music has meant so much to me throughout my love of hardcore and extreme music in general. So yeah, I'm on social media, the Hordes of Manzerfaust, my podcast, Night Cult, NITEKVLT, is available wherever you get your podcasts. I am recording tomorrow, talking about the January 2023 release slab of Vinegar Syndrome Blu-rays. I did a short video last week about those, so you get to hear me go into great detail on that podcast, and even talk about what's coming out in the month of February later on. And I also have a video up about my birthday haul from Red Scroll, just a short 8-minute video, just talking about what I got. I got some cool shit. And yeah, I've been loving the responses I've been getting, you know, a lot of views on the page, a lot of people getting at me with advice and cool little comments here and there, and it's great, man. I've only been doing this 2 weeks, and I'm really having a ton of fun, and I hope you're having fun watching these. This video's gone on a bit longer than usual, but this is really a subject that I wanted to dive as deep into as I possibly can, and just give some aspect of how much love I have for New York hardcore and these bands that made it so important. So yeah, I'm Mike Manzer with Manzerfaust Productions. Don't forget the struggle, don't forget the streets.